Welcome to the Personality Couch podcast, where we discuss all things personality and clinical practice. I'm your host, Doc Bach, and I'm here with my co-host, Doc Fish. We are both licensed clinical psychologists in private practice, and today we are continuing our series on antisocial personality disorder. And we really don't love the DSM description of antisocial, so we're pulling from other psychological theories like psychodynamic and putting antisocial on the proverbial therapy couch. In this episode, we give our analysis of what's going on in the psyche of an antisocial, and this is going to be an interesting one. So let's dive in.
Okay, well, let's start with the DSM. So excluding the lack of remorse criteria in the DSM-5 TR, all the other criteria showcase some kind of observable behavioral piece of the antisocial personality. And I might actually argue that we don't truly know about a lack of remorse in an antisocial because they're probably not going to let you inside their brain because they don't trust you. So we observe the lack of remorse externally. But anyway, that means that the DSM missed the internal process of the antisocial here.
Yep.
But dun dun dun, psychoanalytic literature comes in for the win.
It does. So there is substantial criticism about the DSM antisocial, not only with us, but also with personality gurus like Milan, Akhtar, and Kernberg. They too openly criticize the DSM for focusing way too much on criminal behavior and less so what's inside the psyche. So Akhtar says about the DSM criteria, such emphasis tends to delineate criminal individuals better than antisocial ones, since most antisocial individuals successfully avoid criminal involvements. They lead apparently ordinary lives marked by subtly parasitic, like a parasite, and exploitative behavior.
Oh man, that is fascinating. So all the antisocials who haven't been caught in their antisocialness. But we have a DSM description that totally ignores the internal workings of a personality.
Right. Yeah. Doesn't that sound familiar? Was something that we brought up in critiques with schizoid, right?
Which is always why it's helpful to look at multiple perspectives. And the most comprehensive perspective on the topic of the internal parts of antisocial is found in psychoanalytic theory, which starts with birth and early childhood. Surprise.
Yeah. So with that, we need to jump to what causes antisocial personality to develop. Okay. So I'll kick us off by talking about a really interesting study by Glueck and Glueck in 1956. They found through their follow-up studies that antisocial personality starts early and continues into adulthood.
Yes. So it is thought that antisocial temperaments in infancy may be more aggressive, but this is a chicken and egg question because their environments quickly turn genes on and off. So then it's like, is it nature or nurture? I personally think it's both, but Doc Bach, what did you find about genetics and antisocial?
Yeah, well, there wasn't a whole lot of research on genetics as there was environment, but we also have to remember that this research is tricky because we're often studying antisocial behaviors versus the personality. But alas, there were a couple of prominent studies that I found interesting. So Robbins in 1966 found that having a sociopathic or alcoholic father contributed to antisocial.
Okay, but couldn't that also be environmental?
Technically, yeah. And this is where genetic studies are tricky, like to your chicken and egg point, right? But what's interesting is that their research found that there was a correlation with sociopathy and alcoholism even if the father wasn't present, which implies a potential genetic predisposition to antisocial from the paternal side.
Okay. So that could be genetics then, or an absent father.
Oh, touche.
Right? Like an absent father, either due to substance or physical distance.
Yeah. So is it genetics or is it environment, right? So then we look at twin studies, which give us another peek at things. So there was a study or multiple studies that seemed to find a genetic link in antisocial personality.
Okay, but I can't help but play devil's advocate here. Why is it adoption involved? So I'm thinking like parental substance abuse, abuse in general, neglect, trauma. Like, could adoption be an environmental factor in this to begin with?
Yes, you're asking the right questions here. Yeah, it's really hard to say without finding a specific genetic marker or gene because there's no perfect way to control for environment in these studies. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. So let's jump to the environmental stuff. Overall, childhood environments of antisocials throughout the literature include descriptions like chaotic, insecure, unstable, inconsistent, unloving, unprotective, neglectful, abusive, traumatic, with possible overindulgence of power or dominance. And then also there's like either harsh or no discipline, corruption,
Ooh,
etc.
interesting. So Akhtar actually said that as children, they suffered profound injustices. They were traumatically betrayed. So they experienced traumas of injustice, which is just tragic when you think about it, right? But it also makes sense why the justice system and the law means very little to them. Like that's their origin trauma, the lack of law or justice in the home.
Oh, absolutely. I actually think I have much more to say on this, but I'm going to wait.
Okay. All right. Save the gold. Save the gold.
Okay.
So, research also tells us that antisocials also come from homes with highly narcissistic parents. This leads to lots of anger, especially towards mom, which then comes out toward others.
Right. Specifically, there's often maternal neglect, indifference, alcoholism, emotional and psychological deprivation and neglect. And McWilliams noted that mom could also be weak, depressed, and or masochistic, which then, right, can be paired with that sociopathic or alcoholic father that you mentioned before, or even an absent father, or a father who's explosive, sadistic, inconsistent.
Yeah. So, multiple researchers have pointed out the theme of being unloved as children, which means there's a breakdown in their capacity to love others and themselves, even going so far as having hatred towards others. But because of that lack of parental love, it can lead to a very primitive type of narcissism, which we'll talk about later in defense mechanisms.
But then that makes me think we need to talk about attachment.
Yes.
So some actually argue that antisocial is a disorder of attachment. McWilliams notes that there's a failure of attachment and internalization of good objects. So basically, they didn't attach psychologically to or identify with their parents or caregivers. So they didn't take love in, and then they didn't love others. But she notes that they can identify with an archetypal object. So like finding a father figure that maybe society deems powerful. This could be a superhero. It could just be like whatever the construct of masculinity looks like. Or pathologically, it could be like a serial killer.
Oh, that is real interesting. Yeah. A lot of the literature talks about antisocials having an unrealistic fantasy or hero version of dad in their mind. Maybe because it's easier than accepting that dad is absent or not protective, or maybe because dad went back and forth between being the protector and the persecutor, right? But regardless, in the psyche, the fantasized image of father is a big piece of their internal workings. So it doesn't have to be a real person. To your point, it could be a superhero or any representation of that masculine power.
Right. Because power is important to them.
Yeah.
All that negative stuff in childhood means that they likely felt helpless and without power, like not even having confidence in their own power or in the power of others to help or protect them. So then it makes sense that they would now seek confirmation of their own omnipotence or power.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So picture a child that is neglected, traumatized, abused, etc., and inherently helpless due to age.
Yeah.
But teachers don't save them from their setting. Maybe the cops come a couple times, but they don't save them from their abuse. Child Protective Services was involved maybe a few times, but nothing happened.
Yeah.
So remember how we talked about the injustice in childhood?
Yeah.
The systems and the law failed them. And the child was essentially left to save themselves, to not rely on or to trust others, to reject helplessness and weakness. They had to embody the power that they need.
Yeah.
They might learn like emotions are weak, vulnerability is weak. None of that is tolerable.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have their family of origin who probably didn't help them learn emotions or how to express themselves.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, like words were probably used to control others, which means then manipulation is learned and then action is learned, right? Not emotions, not caring for others. They need to act. They need to have personal power to save the self, to invest in the self, to be self-focused. And I'm also going to propose that that power involves like consuming. So like sometimes consuming materials, the world, others.
Ooh, that is an excellent example. Yeah. You know what consuming reminds me of? Freud actually boiled down all criminal acts into two categories. So a version of incest or parricide. Basically, what that means is either consuming the parent or killing the parent. So crimes of killing others or violating their sexual rights.
So like maybe the edible complex.
Maybe. So he believed that any other crime was disguised as, or possibly even a more regressed form of these things. Serial crimes in these areas serve as a repetition compulsion or mastering a trauma from earliest attachment.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is speaking to the antisocial behavior that can arise from these early attachment traumas. McWilliams actually noted that the objects of attachment can be both a source of terror and rage, which are contradictory, and then it leads to contradictory behaviors. And she provided the example of like a baby who smiles and bites mom. So like inviting that connection, but then also like destroying or hurting at the same time.
Right. This makes so much sense. Yeah. So this also speaks to behavior that stems from an inconsistent upbringing and disorganized attachment as a result, like bite mom or hug mom.
Right. Both.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we have genetics and the environment being just right to make the antisocial personality, but what's actually going on underneath all of that?
Yeah. So what's in the psyche? So Reed in 1985 found that inside the antisocial psyche was depression and emptiness, making them very susceptible to severe depression, sometimes even psychotic depression, and even suicide. So especially during middle age. And I find this timeline particularly interesting because we also know that antisocial behavior and impulsivity ages out around middle adulthood. And it actually makes me wonder if, as the body slows down with age, is the psyche forced to face its demons and not run from them?
Okay, so McWilliams also notes that antisocials can burn out in middle age and can become like surprisingly upright citizens. So maybe hormones, like maybe loss of power that comes with middle age. And then basically like we have to face death and the loss of physical strength. Now, McWilliams also proposed that this might be the reason why there aren't as many female antisocials. So females aren't necessarily as physically strong, and then they have to deal with menstruation, face pregnancy challenges, have increased risk of abuse, and thus females have to face their own weakness earlier.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, so there's lots of interesting gender dynamics at play with the antisocials. Also, antisocials often lack an internal value system, especially with more severe presentations. So, like, what do they stand for? Anything? Like, are there goals or intrinsic motivations? Inside, there's defective empathy and guilt. So if you don't have values to stand on, how can you empathize with another or take their perspective to know when they hurt, right? Like, how can you experience guilt if your compass of right or wrong is misguided? The internal mapping system is off, so relationships are going to suffer.
Sure, but like also, how can you even develop a sense of right and wrong when you're so focused on surviving the traumatic environment that you were just spawned into?
Fair. Yeah.
I do have deep empathy for antisocials who don't care. They don't want my empathy, but I do care.
Yeah.
However, it does not equate to overlooking their harm.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. We can hold empathy for how this personality develops and also still make boundaries and hold them accountable for their actions. So also I'm thinking that antisocials can have two sides to them, right? So especially as they have an unstable sense of who they are. So they experience self-doubt and are confused about their self-identity, actually leading to feelings of inferiority.
But they're so not aware of this at all, like literal denial.
Right. Oh yeah, they would never let on at all. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Kernberg actually believed antisocial self-concept vacillates between shameful and exalted images of the self, which makes them inauthentic, right? So if you look closely, you can see contradictory behaviors stem from this, like maybe gluttony or pleasure seeking versus the self imposed poverty that sometimes they go through because of lack of goals.
Okay. And keep listening because we're soon going to get into what they do with that shame because they do not own it.
Oh, snap. Yes. So this means that their obsession with power and omnipotence that we talked about can also be counteracted with this infantile helplessness.
Yes. So McWilliams notes that just because there's an inability to love doesn't mean that they don't know there's something out there that they're lacking, like something that others are enjoying, which she says leads to something called primitive envy, which is the wish to destroy that which one most desires.
Oh.
So remember, like we want mom, so we smile and then we bite her. So they can't actually articulate this usually, but their behaviors demonstrate it. So they deny, devalue, and depreciate all the tender things in life. For example, Ted Bundy killed or destroyed young women that looked like his mother, noting he needed to own them.
Whoa. Oh my goodness. So they destroy the very thing in which they desire, especially tender things like love. So perhaps Ted Bundy actually desired mama's love in his killing of other women that looked like her.
You got it. Like the psyche is dark and fascinating.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Wow. But let's move on to other defenses that are happening inside the psyche leading to this antisocial behavior. All right. So, all personalities have ways to defend themselves against anxieties and difficulties adapting to their world. All personalities do, right? But for the antisocial, McWilliams highlights four main defenses. So, omnipotent control, projective identification, dissociation, and acting out. So let's look closer at these and also define what they are.
Okay, so omnipotent control is the need to exert and confirm one's power. So there's like an unconscious belief that the self is essentially the basis of all that happens. Like their wish and desires and action determines an outcome, which is technically an extension of the infantile or primary narcissism.
Yeah.
Okay, this goes back to the first 6 months of infancy, where I personally think antisocials get stuck. There is no understanding that others are separate from themselves. So in infancy, this looks like, I'm hungry and therefore I magically get milk. And then there's no recognition that like the other or mom has any control.
Yeah.
Now in adulthood, this could look like something benign, like I can be anything that I want to be. Or maybe winning a gamble that you felt was a winner. Or in a relationship, I've seen this, it could look like inconsideration. It's like, I'm not cold, so you must not be cold.
Right.
Pathologically, this could be getting one over on somebody through conscious manipulation. Like it's found in a lot of areas where there's power dynamics, like politics, business, religious hierarchies, the military. But omnipotent control defends against weakness and shame.
Absolutely. Yeah. This actually reminds me of Abraham's research from 1925, where he talked about the early psychological undernourishment of antisocials in childhood. So you can see how they're stuck in that regressed place because they didn't receive their needs early on.
Again, so my hypothesis is that their deepest wounds and fixation occurred in the first 6 months of infancy with feeding and primary narcissism. Not that they're acting like babies, right? But that is where their deepest wound and hurt stems from.
Yeah. Yeah. And they can. Not all of them do, but they
Sometimes.
can tantrum. All personalities can tantrum.
Yeah, we can all tantrum.
Anyway, there's also a cognitive breakdown here, and we can see a peek at some magical thinking. So, like, it felt like a winning game, therefore it must be. Or I can be anything I want despite limitations. Like that very primitive narcissism is evident in these antisocial types. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. So Burston also believed that this sense of omnipotence stemmed from childhood trauma, where there's safety in relationships only when they're in control and can manipulate the other. So it also denies any dependency needs on the other, and it splits off any feelings of inferiority onto the other, right? So then it also kind of serves as a type of anxiety reliever because the antisocial knows the outcome if they manipulate it and are in charge.
Ooh, an anxiety reliever. That's an interesting way to look at it. But like also deep down, they're not usually super aware of this, if at all.
Yeah, self-awareness is key.
Anyway, the next defense mechanism is projective identification. So that is putting unacceptable characteristics on the other person, which is the projection part, and then acting in a way that elicits the other to identify with it.
Yeah.
So for example, like weakness is not acceptable. So the other person's weak. And then I'm going to act in a way that makes the other person feel weak and identify as weak. According to McWilliams, inability or avoidance of expressing emotions verbally means that the only way to get other people to understand what they're feeling is to evoke that feeling in them.
This is so deep. Yeah. So let me give some examples of this. Like they don't trust you and they elicit mistrust from you. So they're angry, right? And now they're lashing out. So you feel angry too. Or they can't feel empathetic and now you can't find empathy for them.
Exactly. All right. So the third defense mechanism is dissociation. Now this defense is actually really hard to figure out because antisocials lie.
Yeah.
But it is a possibility because abuse and dissociation go together, and antisocials have experienced abuse. McWilliams notes that dissociation in an antisocial can range anywhere from just simply minimizing personal responsibility and harm to complete amnesia for a violent crime.
Yeah, I think this part is so interesting. And I've heard of cases of like feigned amnesia, faking it, basically like, oh, I blacked out, don't blame me for the crime, right? But this dissociation or splitting off from the self, like going somewhere else in the body and mind, like it can be very real in antisocials. And in some cases, the individual may be operating out of this primitive place of trauma. Like they don't even realize it, but they're maybe trying to master that early trauma. And some theorists even say that antisocial behavior is actually a cry for help. Like, save me from this trauma. Catch me.
Oh boy. Okay, so you're so right. And they are never going to admit to crying out for help.
Oh.
My thought on this is that if an action is done in anger, there may be an effect on memory because anger does decrease activity in the hippocampus. But they're very capable of simply just doing a harmful action outside of anger. So the debate on this will probably continue forever.
Yeah.
Let's go to the last defense mechanism, acting out. Antisocials act. When they're upset or elevated, they just act. And so they can have difficulty controlling their impulses.
Yeah. And Doc Fish, you and I actually have a hypothesis that antisocials are probably body types on the Enneagram, most likely type 8s.
I kind of think so. Yeah. So it does take more to get them to the threshold of feeling. So for example, they have a decreased startle response. So if I go and I say boo to an avoidant, they're going to startle. If I say boo to an antisocial, they're going to stare at me unforgivingly until I feel uncomfortable.
Yes. So I could say a cringy, dark, morbid, awful word and then say the word table, and the reaction would be the same, right? Like the darkness has no effect on them. It's just a normal day. And you know what's interesting is that in that way, there's actually an overlap with schizoid and antisocial. No reaction.
Ooh, I like that. Oh, okay. I have to stay on track though. There's an interesting question in this dynamic. Do antisocials lack anxiety, or is the anxiety hidden and invisible? Because after all, they would never admit to such weakness as anxiety. And if they did experience anxiety, they would probably be able to react so fast that no one would see it anyway. Hashtag childhood trauma. They act quick.
Sure. Yeah. This goes back to what we said earlier about manipulation in relationships. Like it's a super stealthy way to conceal anxiety because no one would ever guess that they're being manipulated out of anxiety or weakness, right? Like I think the anxiety is there, just maybe well cloaked and projected outward on the other.
Sure. And I'm going to say anxiety may be experienced and denied, like both. I think maybe really severe, unhealthy antisocials are so stuck in their sympathetic nervous system or like in that fight stance and protective denial that they might truly be disconnected from anxiety.
Okay. So an example, like if you're in a boxing ring, you're not going to startle necessarily if someone comes at you because it's expected. And maybe that's how antisocials feel. Like they're always ready. So there's like less anxiety about things.
I think so. However, healthier antisocials do report some anxiety. And I've actually seen this. Now, it's a deep feeling of dread, like a feeling of pending doom. Like it's not expressed like other personalities may express anxiety. So it's either hidden or it comes out as irritability, anger, and rage.
Yeah.
It's like an elevated sympathetic nervous system fight response, but lacking the actual danger.
Yeah. Which then this leads to the question of like, what is actually happening in the body, right?
Yes. So we do know that antisocials have low serotonin levels and low reactivity in the autonomic nervous system, which is the nervous system that controls all the involuntary stuff we do, like breathing and heart rate. So the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system make up that autonomic nervous system. Abuse triggers the sympathetic nervous system. Now, all of this is important because antisocials have the high sensation seeking and high threshold for pleasurable excitement. So like skydiving.
Yeah. This actually reminds me of sensation seeking and having almost an addiction to novel experiences. And it also makes me think of how antisocial at the disorder level is highly correlated with substance abuse. Like, I think there's a dopamine seeking here.
Sure. I mean, they don't do well regulating their emotions. Sometimes they can go back and forth between like intense anger or rage and like manic exhilaration.
Ooh, I've seen similar things. Yeah. It actually makes me wonder if there's an overlap with bipolar. Like we've already talked about the deep depression inside, but like the thrill seeking and the highs maybe is part of like the mood personality dynamic.
Sure, maybe. I think I view it as a reaction to power. Like if I can handle skydiving or maybe rock climbing without gear, etc., I conquer death. Then one other thing to say here is that their act first, sensation seeking, and difficulty regulating emotions can combine to create a pattern of failing to learn from experience. And this explains the repeated fill in the blank, lying, stealing, lashing out at others, etc.
Exactly. Yeah. And it feeds the underlying distortion of omnipotence, right? I can conquer anything. Like laws of gravity don't apply to me. Watch. Yeah. So the last thing I'll say here is that antisocials often have also a distorted or perverse sexuality, like especially at the disorder level, antisocials. So what this means is that anything is possible for sexual gratification, especially deviant things that most people wouldn't equate with sex, like urinating, defecating, underage partners, that type of stuff, you know?
Ooh, okay.
Yeah.
So finding pleasure in all the things, especially deviant things.
Right.
So with primary narcissism, right, in the first 6 months of life, the infant finds pleasure through every sensory experience. Eating, kicking, seeing, hearing, pooping. Like you've all seen the baby smile after letting out a poop.
Totally.
Yeah. It's a self-oriented form of pleasure that can be deviant in adult sexuality. And then pairing this with their difficulty understanding that others are separate from them, I do think it can often involve sexual power dynamics and domination.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's go back to the trauma and the early experience of pleasure, right? So there was possibly starvation of basic care and basic pleasure. So then they get stuck in this place of development and then seek out pleasure in areas that most adults have moved past from, right? Or adults that are healthy and adjusted see as like taboo or illegal or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. And all in the search of their own self-interest and power.
Yeah.
All right. So coming back around and putting all of this together, we, again, don't like the DSM description of antisocial personality disorder because it only captures behaviors and not the personality underneath.
Yeah.
The PDM gives us a peek into the antisocial's makeup, starting with genetics and adverse childhood environment. Society throws them in the deep end and doesn't save them. So they learn how to swim more powerfully than the rest of us, playing by a different set of rules. Yeah. Their mind, body, and emotions are focused on their own self-interest, originally for survival, but it can turn pathological. Yeah. And that pathological outcome can look quite different if it's mixed with flavors of other personalities. So stay tuned.
Oh, indeed. Yes. We still have so much more to say in this series, including talking about subtypes and how it's different from psychopathy and narcissism and all the things. So make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss it. And if you're a psychology nerd, we also have blogs, visuals, and references that coincide with each episode at www.personalitycouch.com. And if you're a provider looking to consult about a case, or you're in need of psychodynamic therapy or a deep dive psychological evaluation, our private practice, Quest Psych, can help with that. I'll provide a link in the show notes. Be well, be kind, and we'll see you next time on The Personality Couch. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute a professional relationship. If you're in need of professional help, please seek out appropriate resources in your area. Information about clinical trends or diagnoses are discussed in broad and universal terms and do not refer to any specific person or case.